Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still outside the grand oak doors of Buckingham Palace. His black uniform was pressed to perfection. His shoes shined until they reflected the morning light streaming through the tall windows. For 3 years he had been one of the Queen's guards, and every single day felt exactly the same. Wake up at 5 in the morning, quick breakfast of toast and tea, put on the heavy red ceremonial uniform, or the practical black one depending on duty. Stand guard for 8 hours straight. Go home to his small flat in East London. Sleep. Repeat. Most people walking past the palace gates saw the guards as living statues. They took photos, made faces, tried to make them laugh or move. Marcus had learned to tune it all out. His mind would drift to other places while his body remained perfectly positioned. But today was different. Today, an envelope had arrived at his flat with the royal seal. Marcus had stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was an invitation that would change everything. The University of Oxford cordially invites you to speak at our annual Leadership and Service Symposium, the letter read. Your exceptional service record and recent commendation for bravery have brought you to our attention. Marcus read it 3 times. There had to be some mistake. He was just a guard. He stood still and looked straight ahead. What could he possibly have to say to brilliant Oxford students? The recent commendation mentioned in the letter referred to something Marcus tried not to think about. 3 months earlier, during a routine patrol around the palace grounds, he had spotted something unusual. A man in a maintenance uniform was acting strangely near the staff entrance. While other guards might have assumed he belonged there, Marcus noticed tiny details that seemed wrong. The man's uniform was slightly too big. His tool belt looked new, unused. Most importantly, he kept checking his watch and looking around nervously. Marcus had been trained to notice these things, but more than that, something deep in his gut told him this was trouble. Without breaking protocol or causing alarm, Marcus had quietly radioed for backup and approached the man casually. It turned out the stranger was carrying materials that could have caused serious harm. The incident was handled quietly, as these things usually were, but Marcus received a formal commendation that he never expected anyone outside the palace to know about. Now Oxford University wanted him to talk about leadership and service. Marcus laughed out loud in his empty flat. He had barely finished secondary school. He joined the army at 18 because he didn't know what else to do with his life. After serving 2 tours overseas, he applied to be a royal guard because it seemed like steady, honorable work. His childhood in Manchester had been tough. His father worked in a factory until it closed down when Marcus was 12. His mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. They never had much money, but they had something more valuable. They had each other and they had principles. Always do the right thing even when no one is watching, his father used to say. And remember, son, every job is important if you do it with dignity. Marcus had carried those words with him through everything. During cold nights standing guard in Afghanistan, through the long hours of training to become a royal guard, through every single day of standing perfectly still while tourists treated him like a curiosity. But speaking at Oxford, that was terrifying in a way that facing down suspicious characters or standing guard in dangerous places never was. Those situations required him to be alert and ready to act. This would require him to open his mouth and share his thoughts with some of the smartest young people in the country. He looked at the letter again. The date was in 2 weeks. He was expected to speak for 30 minutes about leadership lessons from unexpected places. They wanted him to share his experiences and insights about service, duty, and protecting others. Marcus walked to his small mirror and looked at himself. He saw a 28-year-old man with kind brown eyes and a face that had seen more than most people his age. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing out of uniform. His accent clearly marked him as working class. What wisdom could he possibly offer to future leaders of Britain? But then he remembered something his sergeant had told him during his first week as a royal guard. Thompson, you think too small about yourself. You're not just standing there looking pretty. You're the last line of defense for some of the most important people in the world. Every single day, people trust you with their lives. That's not a small responsibility. Maybe that was true. Maybe there was more to what he did than just standing still and looking official. Over the past 3 years, he had learned things that couldn't be taught in any classroom. He had learned patience when dealing with difficult people. He had learned to stay calm under pressure. He had learned to notice details that others missed. He had learned that true strength often meant showing restraint. Most importantly, he had learned that doing your job well, whatever that job might be, was a form of service that mattered. Not everyone could be a prime minister or a famous scientist, but everyone could choose to approach their work with honor and dedication. Marcus made himself a cup of tea and sat at his small kitchen table. The invitation lay in front of him like a challenge. He could write back and politely decline. He could say he was too busy with his duties or that he didn't feel qualified. No one would think less of him for staying in his lane, or he could take the biggest risk of his quiet life. He could stand up in front of brilliant students and professors and share what he had learned from 3 years of standing guard. He could tell them what his parents had taught him about dignity and hard work. He could explain how paying attention to small details had helped him protect people. He could talk about how anyone, regardless of their background or position, could make a difference through dedication and service. The thought made his stomach flip with nervousness. But somewhere deeper, beneath the fear, he felt something else. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely excited about something. Maybe he did have something valuable to share. Maybe his story mattered more than he realized. Marcus picked up a pen and began writing his response to Oxford University. The next morning, Marcus posted his acceptance letter to Oxford. His hands were steady as he dropped it in the postbox, but his mind was racing. What had he just committed himself to? For the rest of his shift that day, standing guard felt different. Instead of letting his mind wander, he found himself really thinking about what he did and why it mattered. During his lunch break, Marcus did something he had never done before. He went to the local library and checked out books about public speaking. The librarian, an elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes, seemed surprised to see a young man in casual clothes asking for help with presentation skills. "Special occasion?" she asked kindly. "You could say that," Marcus replied, still hardly believing it himself. "I'm speaking at Oxford University in 2 weeks. The librarian's eyebrows shot up. "How wonderful. What's your topic?" "Leadership and service," Marcus said, the words still feeling strange in his mouth. "I'm a Royal Guard, and they want me to share my experiences." The librarian's face lit up with genuine interest. "How fascinating. You know, some of the most powerful speeches I've ever heard were from people who didn't consider themselves natural speakers. They had something real to say, and that authenticity made all the difference." She helped him gather several books about public speaking, storytelling, and presentation techniques. Marcus spent the evening reading instead of watching television. He learned about connecting with an audience, structuring a speech, and managing nervousness. But the more he read, the more overwhelmed he felt. The books talked about sophisticated techniques and professional polish. They assumed the speaker was already comfortable being the center of attention. Marcus was the opposite of that. His entire job was about blending into the background, being invisible unless needed. How was he supposed to suddenly become someone who commanded a room? 3 days before the speech, panic set in completely. Marcus lay awake at night, imagining all the ways it could go wrong. He pictured himself freezing up on stage, stumbling over his words, boring the audience or worse, making a fool of himself and embarrassing the palace. He considered calling Oxford to cancel. He rehearsed the phone call in his head, preparing explanations about sudden illness or urgent duties. But every time he reached for the phone, he heard his father's voice. Always do the right thing even when no one is watching. The right thing wasn't running away from a challenge. The right thing was honoring his commitment and trying his best even if he failed. That weekend, Marcus decided to visit his parents in Manchester. He took the train north, watching the familiar countryside roll past. His parents still lived in the same small house where he had grown up, though it looked smaller now than it had in his childhood memories. His mother, Sarah, opened the door before he could knock. She had that magical parent ability to sense when her child was coming home. She wrapped him in a hug that smelled like the lavender soap she had used for as long as he could remember. "Marcus, what a lovely surprise. Your father's in the garden, pretending to fix things that don't need fixing." They sat around the kitchen table where Marcus had done his homework as a boy. He told them about the Oxford invitation, trying to sound casual about it. His parents exchanged one of those married couple looks that communicated volumes without words. His father, William, leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Oxford University, eh? That's quite something." "I'm terrified, Dad," Marcus admitted. "I don't know what I'm doing." "These are brilliant people who are going to change the world." What can I possibly tell them? His mother reached across the table and patted his hand. Oh, love, you've always underestimated yourself. Remember when you were 8 and you were so nervous about reading in assembly? You practiced that poem for weeks, convinced you'd forget it. Marcus remembered. He had been chosen to recite a poem about autumn for the school's harvest festival. He was sure he would mess up in front of all those parents and teachers. But you didn't forget. His father continued the memory. You stood up there clear as a bell. And afterward, Mrs. Henderson said it was the most heartfelt reading she'd ever heard. You meant every word. That's different, Marcus protested. That was just primary school. No, his father said firmly. That's exactly the same. You succeed when you're genuine, when you care about what you're saying. Don't try to be someone you're not for those Oxford students. Be the son we raised. Be the man who notices when something's wrong and acts on it. Be the person who takes pride in doing his job well, whatever that job is. His mother nodded enthusiastically. Tell them about Mrs. Patterson. Marcus groaned. Mum, that's not a leadership story, but his mother was already launching into the tale. Mrs. Patterson had been their elderly neighbor when Marcus was a teenager. She lived alone and was too proud to ask for help. Even when her garden became overgrown and her shopping became difficult, Marcus had noticed she was struggling and started quietly helping out. He mowed her lawn, carried her groceries, and shoveled her walk in winter. He never made a big deal about it, just saw what needed doing and did it. Leadership isn't always about making grand speeches or commanding armies, his father said when the story ended. Sometimes it's about noticing what needs to be done and doing it without being asked. You've been doing that your whole life. That evening, Marcus walked through his old neighborhood. The streets looked the same, but he felt different somehow. His parents were right, he had been overthinking this. He didn't need to become a different person to speak at Oxford. He needed to share who he already was. He thought about his 3 years as a Royal Guard differently now. Yes, much of it involved standing still, but he had also been trusted with enormous responsibility. He had protected people, prevented problems, and maintained standards of excellence even when no one was watching. He had learned discipline, attention to detail, and the importance of reliability. More than that, he had learned that every person's contribution mattered. The guards, the staff, the drivers, the cooks, they all played essential roles in something bigger than themselves. Oxford students would go on to lead companies, organizations, and maybe even countries. But they would need to understand that leadership wasn't just about being at the top. It was about recognizing and respecting the value of everyone's work. Marcus returned to London feeling calmer but still nervous. He spent the next 2 days writing and rewriting his speech. He threw away the fancy leadership theories he had read about and focused on telling simple, honest stories from his own experience. He wrote about the day he stopped the suspicious man at the palace. He wrote about learning patience from dealing with difficult tourists. He wrote about his parents and Mrs. Patterson and the importance of noticing what needed to be done. The night before his speech, Marcus laid out his best civilian clothes. Tomorrow he would not be wearing his guard uniform. Tomorrow, he would just be Marcus Thompson, a working-class lad from Manchester sharing his story with some of the brightest young minds in Britain. The thought still made him nervous, but now it also filled him with quiet pride. He had something valuable to offer after all. The morning of the speech dawned gray and drizzly, typical October weather in England. Marcus woke up at his usual 5 o'clock, but instead of preparing for guard duty, he stared at the ceiling of his small bedroom. In 6 hours, he would be standing in front of 300 Oxford students and faculty members. The thought made his stomach twist into knots. He made himself breakfast but could barely eat. The toast tasted like cardboard, and his tea had gone cold while he rehearsed his opening lines for the 100th time. Marcus had memorized his speech word for word, but now he worried that would make him sound robotic and unnatural. The train to Oxford took just over an hour from London. Marcus sat by the window watching the countryside blur past, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He had chosen his best dark suit, a simple white shirt, and a navy tie. Looking at his reflection in the train window, he looked respectable enough, but he still felt like an imposter heading to one of the most prestigious universities in the world. A woman across the aisle was reading what appeared to be academic papers covered in complex diagrams. A young man near the front had textbooks stacked beside him and was typing rapidly on his laptop. Marcus felt completely out of place among these clearly brilliant people. What if they saw right through him? What if they realized he was just a working-class guard who had no business speaking about leadership to future world leaders? Oxford Station was smaller than Marcus had expected, but when he emerged onto the street, the sight of the ancient university buildings took his breath away. Stone spires reached toward the cloudy sky, and students in flowing academic gowns hurried between buildings that had stood for centuries. This was where prime ministers and Nobel Prize winners had studied. This was where some of the greatest minds in history had walked these very streets. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell met him at the entrance to the lecture hall. She was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back neatly and intelligent blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her smile was warm but professional. "Mr. Thompson, I presume? I'm Professor Hartwell, head of the Leadership Studies program. We're so pleased you could join us today." "Thank you for inviting me," Marcus replied, surprised that his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I have to admit I'm quite nervous about this." Professor Hartwell laughed kindly. "That's perfectly natural. But I want you to know that your story is exactly what our students need to hear. They're brilliant young people, but many of them come from privileged backgrounds. They need to understand that leadership comes in many forms, and that dedication and service at any level can teach profound lessons." She led him through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished scholars and into a comfortable office where he could wait before his presentation. The walls were covered with books from floor to ceiling, and Marcus felt intimidated all over again. These people lived in a world of ideas and theories that he could barely comprehend. "Can I ask?" Professor Hartwell said as she poured him tea from an elegant china set. "What made you accept our invitation? Many people in your position might have declined." Marcus considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I almost did decline. I kept thinking about what my parents taught me growing up. They said that when someone gives you an opportunity to make a difference, even if you're scared, you should take it. They believe that everyone has something valuable to share from their experiences." Professor Hartwell nodded approvingly. "Your parents sound like wise people. That's exactly the kind of perspective our students need to hear." She explained that the audience would be a mix of undergraduate and graduate students studying various subjects, along with some faculty members. Many were involved in leadership programs or hoped to work in government, business, or nonprofit organizations after graduation. They came from around the world and represented some of the brightest minds of their generation. "No pressure at all," Marcus muttered under his breath, and Professor Hartwell chuckled. "Mr. Thompson, let me tell you something. These students have heard from CEOs, politicians, and academic experts. They've been lectured about leadership theories and management strategies until their eyes glaze over. What they rarely hear is someone speaking from the heart about real service, about finding meaning and purpose in work that others might overlook. That's what you offer." At exactly 2 o'clock, Professor Hartwell led Marcus toward the lecture hall. As they walked down the corridor, he could hear the buzz of conversation from hundreds of young voices. The sound grew louder as they approached the doors. "One last piece of advice," Professor Hartwell said, pausing before they entered. "Don't try to impress them with big words or complex ideas. Just tell them your truth. Share your stories honestly, and trust that your experiences have value." These students are hungry for authenticity. The lecture hall was much larger than Marcus had imagined. Rows of seats rose steeply from the front of the room, filled with young faces that looked impossibly young and brilliant. Some were typing on laptops, others had notebooks open, and all of them were looking down at him with curiosity and polite attention. Professor Hartwell walked to the podium and introduced him with a brief summary of his military service and his role as a royal guard. She mentioned his commendation for bravery, but didn't go into details, leaving that for Marcus to share if he chose to. "Please join me in welcoming Mr. Marcus Thompson," she concluded, and the hall filled with polite applause. Marcus walked to the podium on shaking legs. The microphone looked enormous, and the sea of faces seemed to stretch on forever. For a terrifying moment, his mind went completely blank. He couldn't remember his opening line, couldn't remember why he was there, couldn't remember anything except the pounding of his heart. Then he looked down at his notes, took a deep breath, and remembered his father's words. Always do the right thing. Even when no one is watching, he was here to do the right thing. He was here to share what he had learned, honestly and simply. Marcus looked up at the audience, made eye contact with a friendly-looking young woman in the front row, and began to speak. 3 months ago, I was standing guard outside Buckingham Palace, doing what I do every day, trying to be invisible while staying completely alert. I never imagined that day would lead me here, to this incredible university. Talking to all of you brilliant people about leadership. His voice was steady now, and he could feel some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I'm not here because I'm an expert on leadership theory. I'm here because sometimes the most important lessons about leading and serving others come from the most ordinary places. And I'd like to share with you what I've learned from 3 years of standing very, very still. A few chuckles rippled through the audience, and Marcus felt a spark of confidence. Maybe this wouldn't be a complete disaster after all. Maybe he really did have something worth sharing. Marcus looked out at the sea of attentive faces and felt his confidence growing. The initial terror was giving way to something unexpected, a genuine desire to connect with these young people and share what he had learned. When I tell people I'm a royal guard, they usually picture someone standing perfectly still for hours, looking stern and ignoring tourists trying to make me laugh. And that's partly true. But what most people don't see is everything else that goes into the job. The constant awareness, the split-second decisions, the responsibility of protecting people whose safety affects millions of others. He told them about his typical day, but not in the way most people would expect. Instead of focusing on the ceremony and tradition, he talked about the skills it required. The ability to notice tiny details that might indicate trouble, the patience to deal with difficult people without losing composure, the discipline to maintain the highest standards even when no one seemed to be watching. 3 months ago, I was on routine patrol when I noticed something that didn't feel right. A man in a maintenance uniform was near the staff entrance, but something about him seemed off. His uniform was slightly too big. His tools looked unused. Most importantly, he kept checking his watch and looking around nervously. The audience was completely quiet now, leaning forward slightly. Marcus realized they were genuinely interested in his story. Now I could have assumed he belonged there. It would have been easier to think I was being paranoid. But my training taught me that leadership often means trusting your instincts even when you're not sure. It means taking responsibility for acting on what you observe, even if you might be wrong. He described how he had quietly called for backup and approached the man casually, without creating alarm. How his suspicions had proven correct when the man was found to be carrying materials that could have caused serious harm. How the situation was resolved safely, because someone had been paying attention to details that others might have missed. I'm not telling you this story to make myself sound heroic, Marcus continued. I'm telling you because it taught me something important about leadership that I don't think they teach in business school. Leadership isn't just about making big decisions or giving inspiring speeches. Sometimes it's about being the person who notices what others miss. It's about taking responsibility for the small things that prevent big problems. A young man in the third row raised his hand. Marcus nodded at him. That's fascinating, but how does that apply to those of us who won't be in security roles? How do we develop that kind of awareness in other contexts? Marcus smiled. This was exactly the kind of question he had hoped for. Great question. Let me tell you about my neighbor when I was growing up. Mrs. Patterson was an elderly lady who lived alone. She was proud and independent, never asked for help with anything. But if you paid attention, really paid attention, you could see when she was struggling. He told them how he had noticed small signs that Mrs. Patterson needed help. Her garden becoming overgrown, her difficulty carrying heavy shopping bags, the way she moved more slowly during winter months, how he had started quietly helping without making a big show of it, mowing her lawn and carrying her groceries. The point isn't that I was particularly kind or special. The point is that leadership often starts with noticing. Whether you become doctors, teachers, business leaders, or politicians, your effectiveness will depend partly on your ability to see what's really happening around you, to notice when your team is struggling, when your patients aren't telling you everything, when your students are falling behind, when your community needs something they haven't asked for directly. A young woman near the back raised her hand. But surely there's more to leadership than just being observant. What about making tough decisions, inspiring people, creating change? Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Absolutely. But here's what I learned from my father, who worked in a factory until it closed down when I was 12. He used to say that every job is important if you do it with dignity. He taught me that how you approach your work, any work, shapes who you are as a person and as a leader. He talked about the discipline required to stand perfectly still for 8 hours, to maintain focus and alertness even when nothing exciting was happening. How this had taught him patience, consistency, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. When that suspicious man appeared at the palace, I didn't panic or rush into action. I stayed calm, followed protocol, and made careful decisions based on observation rather than assumption. Those skills didn't come from studying leadership theory. They came from practicing discipline and attention to detail in seemingly mundane situations. Marcus could see students taking notes now, their faces engaged and thoughtful. He felt a surge of confidence that surprised him. Let me share something else my parents taught me. My mother cleaned offices at night to help support our family. She could have seen that work as beneath her, as temporary, as something to be embarrassed about. Instead, she took pride in doing it excellently. She arrived early, stayed late when needed, and treated every office as if it belonged to someone she cared about. He paused, looking around the room. That taught me that leadership isn't about the title you hold or the salary you earn. It's about the standards you set for yourself and the example you provide for others. Whether you're cleaning offices, standing guard, running a company, or governing a country, the principles are the same. Do your work with integrity. Pay attention to details. Take responsibility for your part in something larger than yourself. A professor in the audience raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that many people see guards as invisible. How has that perspective shaped your understanding of leadership? Marcus smiled. This question hit at something he had been thinking about for years. Being invisible taught me one of the most important lessons about leadership I've ever learned. Real influence often happens when people aren't watching you, when you're not getting credit, when no one will ever know what you've done. He told them about countless small interactions during his guard duty. Tourists who were lost and needed directions, elderly visitors who needed assistance, children who were frightened by the formal atmosphere, how he had learned to help people while maintaining his professional demeanor, often without anyone noticing his small acts of kindness. True leadership isn't about being seen and applauded. It's about making a positive difference, even when, especially when, no one will ever know it was you. Some of the most important leaders in any organization are people whose names you'll never hear, who solve problems quietly, who make everyone else's job a little easier, who maintain standards when it would be easier to let things slide. The questions kept coming, and Marcus found himself enjoying the conversation more than he had expected. These students were genuinely curious about his experiences and eager to understand how the lessons from his unconventional background could apply to their future careers. As the session continued, Marcus realized something profound was happening. He wasn't just sharing his story, he was discovering its meaning. Through these questions and conversations, he was understanding for the first time how his experiences had shaped him into someone with valuable insights about leadership and service. As the question and answer session continued, Marcus noticed something remarkable happening in the room. The initial polite attention had transformed into genuine engagement. Students were leaning forward, taking detailed notes and asking increasingly thoughtful questions. He could see in their faces that his words were resonating in ways he never expected. A young man with an accent that sounded Eastern European raised his hand. Mr. Thompson, I come from a country where we don't always trust authority figures. How do you earn respect and trust when you're in a position that some people might automatically distrust? The question struck Marcus as particularly insightful. During his years as a guard, he had encountered people from all walks of life and many different cultural backgrounds. Some approached him with automatic respect, others with suspicion, and some with outright hostility. That's an excellent question, Marcus replied. In my experience, trust isn't something you can demand because of your uniform or position. It's something you earn through consistent actions, one interaction at a time. He told them about an incident from his second year as a guard. A group of protesters had gathered outside the palace, demonstrating against government policy. They weren't violent or threatening, but they were angry and vocal. Some of his fellow guards seemed tense, viewing the protesters as potential troublemakers to be watched carefully. But I realized that these people weren't my enemies. They were citizens exercising their democratic rights. They had genuine concerns and frustrations, even if I didn't agree with their methods or message. So instead of viewing them as a threat to manage, I tried to see them as people to serve. Marcus described how he had noticed an elderly protester who seemed to be struggling in the crowd. The man was using a walking stick and appeared tired from standing for hours. Without abandoning his post or compromising security, Marcus had quietly arranged for the man to have access to a place where he could sit down while still participating in the demonstration. That small act of consideration completely changed the dynamic. The protesters stopped seeing me as just another symbol of authority and started seeing me as a person. They became more cooperative, more willing to work with security requirements. The whole situation became more peaceful and manageable. A young woman near the middle of the room raised her hand. But what if your small acts of kindness are seen as weakness? What if people try to take advantage of your compassion? Marcus nodded. Another great question. I've learned that there's a crucial difference between being kind and being weak. Kindness with clear boundaries is actually a position of strength, not weakness. He shared an example of dealing with difficult tourists who sometimes tried to provoke reactions from the guards. Some would make inappropriate comments, try to get guards to break character, or even attempt to touch or interfere with them physically. Early in my career, I thought I had two choices: ignore them completely or respond firmly enough to shut them down. But I learned there was a third option. I could acknowledge their humanity while maintaining my boundaries. A slight nod to show I heard them, combined with unwavering professionalism, often worked better than complete stonewalling or harsh responses. Marcus explained how this approach had taught him about leadership in difficult situations. You don't have to choose between being respected and being respectful. You can be firm about standards while still treating people with dignity. In fact, people often respond better to authority that recognizes their worth as human beings. Professor Hartwell, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, raised her hand. Mr. Thompson, you've talked about observation, discipline, and treating people with dignity. But what about decision-making under pressure? Can you share an example of a time when you had to make a quick, important decision? Marcus thought for a moment. The story that came to mind wasn't from his guard duty, but from his earlier military service. However, he realized it illustrated principles that applied to both experiences. This actually happened during my Army service in Afghanistan, but the lessons apply to civilian leadership as well. Our unit was providing security for a medical convoy heading to a remote village. We received intelligence that there might be threats along the route, but the medical supplies were urgently needed. The room became even quieter as students sensed this would be a more serious story. About halfway to our destination, our lead vehicle spotted something suspicious on the road ahead. It could have been an improvised explosive device, or it could have been debris from a recent storm. We had to decide quickly whether to turn back, take a longer alternate route, or investigate carefully. Marcus explained how the decision involved weighing multiple factors: the urgency of the medical mission, the safety of his team, the reliability of the intelligence they had received, and the resources available to investigate safely. I learned that good decision-making under pressure isn't about having all the answers immediately. It's about quickly gathering the best information available, consulting with people who have relevant expertise, and then taking responsibility for a choice based on your values and priorities. In this case, they had chosen to investigate carefully using proper procedures, discovered that the object was indeed dangerous, and found a safe alternate route that delayed them by only an hour. The medical supplies reached the village safely. No one was hurt and the mission succeeded. But the most important lesson wasn't about the specific tactical decision. It was about leadership process, how you gather information, how you consider the welfare of everyone affected, how you balance competing priorities, and how you take responsibility for the consequences. A student near the back called out, "How do you deal with self-doubt?" "I mean, you must have moments where you question whether you're making the right choices." Marcus smiled. "Every day. Self-doubt isn't the enemy of good leadership. Overconfidence is. Questioning your decisions, seeking advice, admitting when you don't know something, these are signs of strength, not weakness." He told them about his first month as a Royal Guard when every shift felt overwhelming. He was constantly worried about making mistakes, missing important details, or somehow failing in his duties. My sergeant at the time gave me advice that changed everything. He said, "Thompson, the fact that you're worried about doing well means you probably will do well. The guards I worry about are the ones who think they know everything already." Marcus explained how he had learned to channel his self-doubt into motivation for continuous improvement, reading about security procedures during his off hours, observing how more experienced guards handled difficult situations, asking questions and seeking feedback rather than pretending to have all the answers. Leadership isn't about being perfect or having unlimited confidence. It's about caring enough about your responsibilities that you work constantly to get better at them. Some of the best leaders I've known were people who admitted their limitations and surrounded themselves with others who complemented their weaknesses. The conversation was now flowing naturally, with students building on each other's questions and Marcus finding connections between his experiences and their future ambitions. He was amazed at how engaged they were, how seriously they were taking his insights. A young woman who had been quiet throughout most of the session finally raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm studying to become a doctor. Sometimes I feel like the medical field is so hierarchical, so focused on credentials and expertise. How do I apply what you're saying about service and attention to detail in an environment where I'll be at the bottom of the ladder for years?" Marcus felt a deep connection to this question. It reminded him of his own feelings when he first started as a guard, surrounded by people with more experience and higher ranks. "That's probably the most important question anyone has asked today," he said. "Because here's what I've learned. Your position on the ladder doesn't determine your ability to lead or serve others. Some of the most influential people I've encountered were nowhere near the top of their organizations." He told them about a custodian at the palace named George, an older man who had worked there for over 20 years. George was technically one of the lowest-ranking employees, but Marcus had watched him quietly solve problems and support other staff members in ways that made the entire operation run more smoothly. George knew everyone's name, remembered their families, and somehow always appeared when someone needed help. He had no official authority over anyone, but people listened to him because they trusted his judgment and appreciated his kindness. He influenced the culture of the workplace more than some people with much fancier titles. Marcus looked directly at the medical student. "In your field, you might be a junior doctor, but you'll have unique opportunities to serve patients and support colleagues. You'll notice things that busy senior doctors might miss. You'll have time to listen to patients who feel rushed through the system. You can be the person who makes everyone else's job a little easier, and everyone's experience a little better." Another student jumped in. "But what about when you disagree with people above you? What if you see problems that your superiors don't want to acknowledge?" This question hit close to home. Marcus had faced situations where he had concerns that weren't immediately shared by others in the chain of command. "That's one of the hardest parts of leadership at any level," Marcus admitted. "I've learned that how you raise concerns matters as much as what those concerns are. Timing matters, approach matters, and you have to be prepared for the possibility that you might be wrong." He shared a story about a time when he had noticed what seemed like a security vulnerability in one of the palace protocols. His initial impulse had been to point it out immediately and emphatically. But instead, he had taken time to gather specific observations, research the history of the protocol, and present his concerns respectfully through proper channels. It turned out that what I saw as a vulnerability was actually an intentional feature of the system that I hadn't fully understood. But my supervisors appreciated that I had brought it to their attention thoughtfully and professionally. They explained the reasoning behind the protocol, and I learned something important about how complex security systems work. Marcus paused, then continued. "But there was also a time when my concerns were valid, and raising them led to improvements in our procedures. The key was that I had built credibility through consistent good work and thoughtful communication. When I did raise concerns, people listened because they knew I wasn't complaining for the sake of complaining." Professor Hartwell glanced at her watch and indicated that they were nearing the end of the allocated time. "Mr. Thompson, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our students?" Marcus looked around the room at all these bright, eager faces. He thought about his journey from a working-class childhood in Manchester to this moment at one of the world's most prestigious universities. He thought about his parents, who had taught him that dignity came from how you approached your work, not what work you did. He thought about all the small moments of choice that had led him here. "I guess what I want to leave you with is this," Marcus said, his voice carrying new confidence and warmth. "You're going to go out into the world and do amazing things. You'll probably hold important positions and make decisions that affect many people. But remember that leadership isn't just about the big moments. It's built in the small moments, in the daily choices to pay attention, to treat people with respect, to take responsibility, to keep learning." He paused, gathering his thoughts for his final message. "Don't wait until you have an impressive title to start leading. Start now, wherever you are, with whatever role you have. Notice what needs to be done. Care about doing your work well. Support the people around you. Stand up for what's right. These habits will serve you whether you're a new graduate, a department head, or running a country. The applause that followed was warm and sustained. Students were smiling, some were wiping their eyes, and Marcus could see that his words had truly connected with them. As the applause died down, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with recognition or praise. He had shared something meaningful, something that might actually help these remarkable young people become better leaders and better human beings. After the formal presentation ended, something unexpected happened. Instead of filing out immediately as Marcus had expected, many students lingered. They approached him with additional questions, personal stories, and requests for advice. The formal lecture had transformed into intimate conversations that felt more like mentoring sessions than academic discussions. A young woman named Sarah introduced herself as a third-year politics student from Wales. "Mr. Thompson, I come from a small mining town where my father worked underground for 30 years. I've always felt out of place here at Oxford, like I don't belong among all these privately educated students. Your speech today was the first time I've heard someone talk about background and class in a way that made me feel proud of where I come from." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. This was exactly what he had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. "Sarah, let me tell you something. Your father's 30 years underground required more courage and dedication than most people will ever show in their entire careers. That's in your blood. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of that heritage." They talked for several minutes about the unique perspectives that working-class backgrounds bring to leadership roles. Sarah shared her dreams of working in government to advocate for communities like the one she came from. Marcus encouraged her to see her background not as something to overcome, but as a strength that would help her understand and serve people that other politicians might overlook. A young man named James, who was studying business, had a different kind of question. "I've been offered internships at several investment firms in London. They're prestigious positions that could launch my career, but honestly, I'm not sure they align with my values. How do you know when to compromise and when to stand firm?" Marcus appreciated the thoughtfulness of the question. "That's something I've wrestled with too. When I was deciding whether to become a Royal Guard, some people told me it was a waste of my military training, that I should aim for something more ambitious. But I realized that meaningful work isn't always about climbing ladders or maximizing income." He explained how he had learned to evaluate opportunities based on whether they allowed him to serve something larger than himself, whether they let him use his skills in ways that mattered, and whether they aligned with the values his parents had taught him. "That doesn't mean you have to take a vow of poverty or avoid all ambition," Marcus clarified, "but it does mean thinking carefully about what kind of person you want to become and what kind of impact you want to have. Sometimes the most prestigious path and the most meaningful path are the same. Sometimes they're not." Professor Hartwell eventually had to interrupt the informal conversations to remind everyone that the hall was needed for the next lecture. But even as students reluctantly gathered their belongings, several approached Marcus with business cards and invitations to stay in touch. As the room emptied, Professor Hartwell walked over to Marcus with a broad smile on her face. "That was extraordinary. In 15 years of organizing these talks, I've never seen students respond quite like that. You've given them something they couldn't get from any textbook or traditional leadership expert." Marcus felt a warm glow of satisfaction, but also something deeper, a sense that he had discovered a new purpose, a new way to serve others beyond his role as a guard. "Professor Hartwell, can I ask you something? Do you think there might be other opportunities to share these ideas with students? Not necessarily here at Oxford, but perhaps at other schools or organizations?" Her eyes lit up with interest. "Absolutely. I'm already thinking about universities that would benefit from hearing your perspective. There's also a national conference on public service leadership next spring. Would you be interested in speaking there?" The thought of addressing an even larger audience still made Marcus nervous, but the nervousness was now mixed with excitement rather than pure terror. "Yes, I think I would be very interested in that." On the train back to London, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few hours. This morning he had been a nervous Royal Guard heading to give a speech he felt unqualified to deliver. Now he was someone who had successfully shared valuable insights with brilliant young people and had been invited to do it again. But more than that, he had gained a new understanding of his own experiences and their value. The stories he had always considered ordinary helping an elderly neighbor, noticing suspicious behavior, learning patience and discipline, had resonated with future leaders in ways he never imagined possible. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. "How did it go, love? We're thinking of you." Marcus smiled and typed back, "Better than I ever imagined. I'll call you tonight and tell you everything." When he arrived back at his flat that evening, Marcus looked around the small space with new eyes. The simple furniture, the few books on leadership he had borrowed from the library, the carefully pressed uniform hanging in his wardrobe. Everything looked the same, but he felt fundamentally different. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at his kitchen table with a notebook. For the first time in his life, he began writing down his thoughts and experiences not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wrote about the questions the students had asked and the connections he had made between his work and their aspirations. He wrote about leadership lessons that he had learned but never articulated before. As he wrote, Marcus realized that today had been a beginning rather than an end. He had discovered that he had something valuable to offer, beyond his physical presence and protection skills. He had found his voice and learned that his experiences, however humble they might seem, contained wisdom that others could benefit from. The next morning, Marcus returned to his post at Buckingham Palace. Everything about his routine was the same. The early wake-up, the pressed uniform, the long hours of standing guard. But his perspective had transformed completely. Instead of seeing his work as something he did while waiting for his real life to begin, he now understood it as a crucial part of his ongoing education in leadership and service. Every interaction with tourists, every moment of maintaining discipline and focus, every small act of helpfulness, all of it was preparation for the larger impact he was beginning to believe he could make. During his lunch break, Marcus walked to the library where he had first sought help with public speaking. The same elderly librarian was there, and she recognized him immediately. "How did your Oxford speech go?" she asked with genuine interest. "It went better than I ever dreamed," Marcus replied, "and I have you to thank for helping me prepare." "Nonsense," she said with a warm smile. "You had everything you needed already. You just needed to believe in yourself enough to share it." As Marcus walked back to his post, he carried with him a new sense of purpose and possibility. He was still a royal guard, still committed to his duties and responsibilities. But now he was also something more, a voice for the value of humble service, an advocate for the leadership potential that exists in everyone. Regardless of their background or position, the young man who had once seen himself as just another invisible guard now understood that there was no such thing as just anything when you approached your work with dignity, attention, and care for others. 6 months after his Oxford speech, Marcus Thompson's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. Word of his presentation had spread through academic and professional networks, leading to invitations from universities, corporations, and government agencies across Britain and beyond. What had started as one terrifying speech had become a new calling. He was still a royal guard. That remained his primary responsibility and source of identity. But now he also spent weekends and vacation days traveling to share his insights about leadership, service, and finding meaning in any role. Each speaking engagement taught him something new about connecting with different audiences and adapting his message to various contexts. At a business conference in Edinburgh, he spoke to executives about the importance of noticing what frontline employees observe. At a police training academy, he discussed decision-making under pressure and building trust with diverse communities. At a teacher's college, he talked about the leadership opportunities that exist in every classroom interaction. The most meaningful invitation came from his old secondary school in Manchester. Standing in the same assembly hall where he had once recited poetry as a nervous 8-year-old, Marcus spoke to current students about possibilities they might not see for themselves. "I stood in this very spot 20 years ago, terrified of speaking in front of people," he told them. "I never imagined I would grow up to address Oxford University or speak to business leaders across the country. Not because I became someone different, but because I learned to value who I already was." Many of the students came from backgrounds similar to his own: working-class families, limited resources, parents who worked hard in jobs that others might overlook. He saw in their faces the same mixture of hope and doubt that he remembered feeling at their age. "Your background is not a limitation to overcome," he told them. "It's a foundation to build on. The values you learn from families who work hard, who take care of each other, who find dignity in any honest work. These are exactly the values that make great leaders. After the presentation, a 15-year-old girl approached him shyly. "Mr. Thompson, my mom cleans offices at night like your mom did. Sometimes I'm embarrassed when my friends ask what she does for work. After hearing you today, I think I should be proud instead." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. "You absolutely should be proud. Your mother is providing an essential service that makes other people's work possible. She's showing you every day what dedication and responsibility look like. That's a gift that will serve you for the rest of your life." The ripple effects of Marcus's speaking went beyond the formal presentations. Oxford students began reaching out to him with updates on their careers and continued questions about leadership challenges they faced. Sarah, the politics student from Wales, wrote to tell him she had been selected for a prestigious government internship and credited their conversation with giving her the confidence to pursue opportunities she might have otherwise considered beyond her reach. James, the business student who had questioned whether to take the investment firm internships, had instead chosen to work for a social enterprise focused on community development. "Your speech helped me realize that meaningful work and successful work don't have to be different things," he wrote. Professor Hartwell invited Marcus to return to Oxford for a follow-up session, this time as part of a panel with other speakers who brought non-traditional perspectives to leadership education. He found himself sharing the stage with a former professional athlete who now worked in youth development, a chef who had built a restaurant empire while maintaining his commitment to sustainable practices, and a social worker who had revolutionized approaches to community organizing. "What all of you demonstrate," Professor Hartwell told the audience during the panel discussion, "is that leadership wisdom comes from lived experience, not just academic study. The most effective leaders are often those who understand service from the ground up, who have learned patience and resilience through practice, who see opportunities for impact that others might miss." Marcus had also begun writing, documenting the stories and insights he shared in his speeches. What started as personal notes had evolved into articles for professional journals and magazines. A publisher had approached him about writing a book, an idea that still seemed surreal but increasingly appealing. The book would be called Standing Guard: Leadership Lessons from Unexpected Places. It would weave together stories from his military service, his work as a Royal Guard, his childhood in Manchester, and the conversations he had had with students and professionals around the country. The central message, he explained to the publisher, is that everyone has leadership experiences even if they don't recognize them as such. The parent who manages a household, the shop clerk who helps difficult customers, the maintenance worker who keeps things running smoothly, they're all practicing leadership skills that apply to much larger contexts. On a particularly busy day at the palace, Marcus found himself reflecting on how much had changed while so much remained the same. He was still standing at his post, still maintaining the same high standards of alertness and professionalism. But now he understood his work as part of a larger story about service, responsibility, and the dignity of any job done well. A group of tourists approached, and one of them, a young man who looked to be university age, recognized him. "Excuse me, aren't you Marcus Thompson? I heard you speak at my university last month. Your presentation completely changed how I think about leadership and careers." Marcus smiled but maintained his professional demeanor. "I'm glad you found it helpful. I hope you're applying some of those ideas in your own life." "I am," the young man said enthusiastically. "I'm studying engineering, and I used to think leadership was just for people in management. But you helped me realize that I can be a leader right now in how I approach my studies and work with my classmates." After the tourists moved on, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had hoped for, that his message would inspire people to see leadership potential in their current circumstances, rather than waiting for permission or perfect conditions to begin making a positive impact. That evening, Marcus called his parents to share the day's events. These regular check-ins had become even more meaningful since his speaking career began. His parents were his most enthusiastic supporters, often sharing stories about neighbors and friends who had heard about his success. "Your father and I watched a video of your speech at that business conference," his mother said. "We were so proud we could hardly contain ourselves. But what made us proudest wasn't seeing you on stage with all those important people. It was hearing you talk about the values we tried to teach you, and knowing that you're sharing those values with others," his father added. You remember what I always told you about doing the right thing even when no one is watching? Well, son, now lots of people are watching and you're still doing the right thing. That's what matters most. As Marcus prepared for sleep that night, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. From a frightened child reciting poetry in school assembly, to a young soldier serving overseas, to a royal guard learning patience and discipline, to a speaker inspiring others to find leadership in unexpected places. Each phase had built on the previous one, creating a foundation of experience and wisdom that he was now able to share with others. He had learned that leadership wasn't about having all the answers or achieving a certain position. It was about caring enough about your responsibilities and the people around you to keep learning, keep growing, and keep looking for ways to serve. Tomorrow he would return to his post at Buckingham Palace, standing guard with the same dedication he had shown for over 3 years. But he would also continue preparing for his next speaking engagement, working on his book, and responding to the letters and emails from people whose lives had been touched by his story. Marcus Thompson had discovered that being just a royal guard was actually being exactly what the world needed. Someone who understood that true leadership begins with faithful service wherever you find yourself, whatever role you happen to fill.